All right, guys, time for another game theory sort of community discussion video. If you like the videos, like, sub, silly, comment, share, support the channel if you want. Appreciate it. Thanks. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about what I was talking about yesterday and stuff that I've also talked about in other videos before, like this pyramid example. Don't look at me, weird Pikachu. I know it's a peepee. It's not a peepee. It's a pyramid. And I want to give a little bit of credit where credit is due, sort of, or a little bit to talk about this in terms of talking about our games harder now, right? Because I do think that fighting games are harder in terms of, I have talked about before that there's this sort of GED sort of ideology or so, a GED sort of like analogy I want to use for fighting games, you could say. And a GED is basically what I talk about is if you don't pass high school or some shit like that, or if you get kicked out of high school, whatever it is, you can get a GED. And a GED basically says you are smart enough to survive in society, right? And I do think that it is harder to get your GED in fighting games now, in modern fighting games. That aspect of fighting games, to me, I think is harder than old school games. But I actually think that's because new school games are not intuitive, actually, right? Now, I want to go to this pyramid example, not a PP, right? And I've used this pyramid example before in multiple videos to talk about what makes a good player, right? And we're going to relate this to a GED and, people talking about Vega and Super Turbo and all this kind of stuff, right? You got this upper echelon, let's say it's a 10, right? We've already fucked up the marker wasn't on. That's the quality control here in FGC on NBC. A 10 is the theoretical perfect player, right? We don't get there, right? You're normally ever going to see a 9. Not a penis analogy at all. Normally, the biggest pyramid you're ever going to see is a 9, right? No one can ever get to be a 10, right? And then we got the bottom players here, say a 0. Oh, geez, Bob, and you're telling me this isn't a PP? It's not a PP, Pikachu. Yeah, sure, whatever. So, but most people, if you think about fighting games, they actually get into this, middle level, let's say, right? So they fall somewhere here. And the middle level can be fairly vast, right? And this middle level also is comprised of things that I've talked about, like the bully zone, right? The bully zone is something that I relate to. There's this sort of mid-level player, let's say. And again, the mid-level can vary, But a mid-level player can bully you with a tactic, right? But they're also more likely to be bullied by a tactic themselves because they're not truly a good player. They're not like a 7, 8, or a 9, right? But they can bully players in their range, right? And I've also talked about that one of the reasons that things like custom combos and homogenized mechanics are bad, and I know this is a long forward, but in case you don't want to watch all those videos where I go more in depth, a reason why something like custom combos are so bad is because custom combos are effective at every level. It doesn't matter if you're starting off as a 0 to the level of a 10. Custom combos are effective at every level, and they can make you feel like you're a better player than you actually are. Because there is no level that custom combos in a game like Alpha 2 are not effective. So you could have a scrub-a-dub, just a baby sperm, to a mid-level player, to a top-level player. These custom combos are effective at every level. But again, you can watch those videos if you want me to go more in depth about that. And of course, and what dictates what is a good player, it could be something like execution. It could be your adaptability. It could just be your knowledge. It could be your reaction times, whatever. Lots of things can create a good player, right? But I want to talk about this level right when we get to, this is like the GED zone, let's say, that you have an idea of what is going on in a fighting game, right? This GED zone, to show that you can survive in the world, is harder to get to in a newer fighting game, I think, because fighting games now are not intuitive, right? Again, this is another correlation doesn't equal causation thing, right? If we're to look at a game like, say, Super Turbo, what is keeping you from reaching just this threshold of being a GED player, let's say, right? Because old school games, and you might think, again, this might be a bit more subjective instead of objective, but I'll throw a bit of a subjectivity into this. In an old school game like Street Fighter 2, if we were to classically think about what is fighting games, because the games are not so oversaturated with systems and all these different kind of mechanics, you don't see players reading the cliff notes of a match. Oh, this move will always be plus this move will always be minus this, right? Again, it's not an example I've used in fighting games before. Think about how often it is now, say in a game like Dragon Ball Fighter Z, how often do you do a special move, and if a character, let's say, starts right here, but he flies towards you over here, right? Hopefully is my face in the way of this? No, it's not. If he flies over here, even though it takes 5 frames, say, to get to here, he's still the same plus or minus disadvantage because the game is so pre-planned that this move can only have this plus or minus, right? I mean, that's why another reason why games are such cliff notes, because everything is so pre-planned. There's no player expression almost. There's no exploration of the game. This move must do this. This move does this, right? But again, if you think about a old school game, right, without such oversaturated of systems and pre-plannedness of things, right, to get to this theoretical level in an old school game, guess which one of these not veins, these attributes, is pretty much the most important, I would say, is maybe the one factor keeping you from doing it. If you're thinking about Street Fighter 2, it's probably your execution, right? And although execution does matter at every level to an extent, although I'll talk about that, I'll throw a little bit of a curveball here in a second. Street Fighter 2, because the game is intuitive, I think, right? Moves don't do weird things. Most moves, if you have just a basic level, let's say, of fighting game knowledge, if you look at Street Fighter 2, it's reasonable to assume this move does this, right? Because a lot of moves aren't even punishable, let's say, in Super Turbo, right? Moves are just fast. Moves are very powerful, right? It's the balance and the chaos, right? But the execution is probably what's keeping you, is the cliff notes of Street Fighter 2. You can look at Street Fighter 2 and not get to the level of an upper player, but to get to Street Fighter 2, to get a basic grasp of the situation, it's probably just your execution at first that is keeping you from this sort of GED level. But if you were to think about a new school game with all this oversaturation of systems, right? Your execution isn't going to be keeping you from passing your GED test. To pass your GED test in a new school game, you need to study. You need to look at all the systems, right? Oh God, what is Slimer Rush? What is Drive Rush? What is this? Okay, this combo, it's like, I know there's not going to be any actual individuality in this game. There's going to be absolutely no individuality in this game. There's not going to be any curveball during the GED test. But to pass this GED test, it's long. I'm going to have to study a while because every move is set in stone. This must be plus this. This must be minus this. This move will always do this. This move will always do this. I got to read the cliff notes and study for the test to get to this theoretical level. My execution isn't going to keep me from passing the GED test because execution basically doesn't matter. Right? So in that sense, fighting games are harder now, I think. Even when I've said before, when I've thought if I would, ever play a game again now, like if I were to come back and play Street Fighter 6 competitively or something like that, I'd probably have to sit down and like think about it actually a little bit, because I'm like, oh geez, there's things like muscle memory and like, okay, this does this. I'd have to study for a little bit. Even when I was doing all those Dragon Ball Fighter Z tech videos, and admittedly, of course, Dragon Ball Fighter Z, the stuff I was doing in the game was so advanced. You know what I mean? Maybe I could have just scrubbed up my way and won so much stuff. I mean, look at all that Vegito tech that people were saying was fake. until like 3-4 years later, people realized it was real, and then Bandai Namco patched it out, right? But you know, a game like Dragon Ball Fighter Z, oh god, okay, this is always going to be plus this. This is always going to be minus this. I can't just look at the move and think, oh, well, this move hit later, so now I can probably punish it. Or now I can't probably punish it because the move hit later. The games aren't intuitive. It's a fucking math problem, right? Do you get what I'm saying? Whereas if you play an old school game, which again might be a little bit subjective, this argument, and normally I try to keep my arguments fairly objective, right? But this could be a little bit subjective, right? But generally, old school games are pretty intuitive. They're not that crazy to pass the GED test. To pass the GED test of an old school game, it's not you studying all day. It's you actually trying to get the execution to do it. Do you get what I'm saying? And of course, this is where we go. Execution is a skill, whether or not you want to admit it, right? Now, to go back to one of these, why I think such the Vega example in Super Turbo is also such a disingenuous example, is Vega is one of the characters in Super Turbo, which you can say does not have to pass the GED test of Super Turbo to be effective. Vega, to get to the GED level in Super Turbo, there's no test. There's no execution, right? Wall dive shenanigans, there's no passing the GED test to do it. It's as basic as you can get. Now, this isn't to say that you can pass the GED test in Super Turbo and then, you're going to be a 10 or a great player, right? Because how many people are actually legitimately great players? Legitimately even good players, right? Like I said, more often than not, most people fall into this mid-range, right? Of, let's say 4 to 6 inches. Oh, Bob, this isn't a pee-pee, Bob. No, it's not. It could be bigger, right? You know what I mean? But, for sake of the joke, right? And this is where I've talked about before. And this sort of passing the GED test, this is the bully zone, right? This is the bully zone of fighting games. Because to get to this level, then once you've passed the GED test, maybe you only have one of your attributes besides that. Some character matchup specific stuff, but you don't have good reaction time. Or you have the reaction time, but your character specific knowledge is not that great. Your adaptability, you have some sort of, attribute if it's like a sports game, right? There's some sort of sport that you've reached this middle level ground of passing the GED test. And then we have to look at your stats like a sports game or like an RPG. You have a pretty good stat there, right? And maybe you want to bully other people in your zone with this stat. Oh, I'm pretty good at this, so I can bully you with this. But because you're not a truly good player, you can always be bullied by something else in this zone, right? But to reach this actual then good level, you need to have a little bit of everything. You need to average out a little bit of everything to be a actual good player, right? And that's why, though I talk about something like, why is Alpha 2 such a bad game? People, oh, blah, blah, blah. Because guess what? It doesn't, all these levels that I'm talking about are null and void to custom combos. Custom combos are effective at every fucking level. It is a homogenized, overpowered system that your skill, it's not affected by. It is a threat at every single level. It is that powerful of a tool, that powerful of a homogenized tool. Alpha 2, like I said, Alpha 2 is a game that does not stand up to any fucking scrutiny whatsoever when you actually start dissecting the game, okay? Game looks cool, though. I do think the game looks cool and has a cool vibe. But if you actually think about being a well-made game, Alpha 2 is a terribly made game, right? And that's not to say that Super Turbo is the best made game. That's not to say any of these old school games are the greatest game ever, because lots of games have problems, right? New games have good stuff too. Not all new games are all just full of terrible stuff, right? But again. So I do think that is something that I will also say is again, correlation doesn't equal causation. I do think that is a harder thing to do in new school games. To reach the GED level is harder in new school games because the games are so pre-planned, so unintuitive, that you have to study just to get to that level. Now, maybe you don't have to study as much as another game to truly get to good. Because, I mean, let's say once you pass the threshold of being past the threshold of a GED, maybe it's easier to get to a 6 or a 7. So let's say, again, theoretically, let's say in Super Turbo, the only thing stopping you from getting to a 4 is just your execution, and boom, you can get to it easier. But then once you get to this level, increasingly difficult because the game is not pre-planned. There's a lot more nuance to it, right? Which again, the disingenuous example would be a character like Vega. Not that I think Vega is the most broken character ever in a game, but guess what? Vega doesn't have to pass the GED test to be effective like other characters, right? That normal GED test passing, Vega got a free scholarship. They gave Vega a free scholarship into Super Turbo, okay? Vega got the free scholarship into Super Turbo. He didn't even have to pass the test. They just let him in, right? But guess what? Every game has characters that are better than others. So Vega, like I said, doesn't even bother me because if you actually think about Super Turbo, Vega actually does have weaknesses. Super Turbo is a crazy game when you think about it. Super Turbo is just, you know what I think is more cheap than Vega and Super Turbo? I would actually say something like T-Hawk if you're actually thinking about it. The option select DP throw stuff, that is cheaper, I would say, than Vega, right? Because theoretically, why would you be safe? That's actual bad game design. I don't actually look at Vega and think of Vega as a terribly designed character. If you actually think about the game objectively, but hopefully you get what I'm saying talking about. Newer school games, yes, to get to the GED level, I think it's harder. But then once you get to that GED level, you can get to the top of the class, at least that class. Maybe you won't get to Harvard, but you can get to the top of the class easier, right? And again, like I said, hopefully you don't misconstrue what I'm saying because then once you get to it, because the games are so homogenized, that's why it's easier than once you actually pass the GED test because there's not a lot to differentiate you from your classmates, right? The games are more homogenized, right? The games are so pre-planned, it's harder to find unique interactions between characters. So of course, once you actually pass the GED test and there's not enough to differentiate you to actually get to these theoretical great levels, and that's not to say that there's not better players or worse players in newer games, because of course there is. But when there's less to differentiate you from your competition, then yes, the game is going to seem more difficult to win, especially when you have to study like you do. Right? New school game, again, Vega. The Vega example is such a fucking what is the English argument? Is it a straw man argument? Is that what you would call that? It's a retarded argument, and this idea that people want to complain about Super Turbo when Super Turbo has withstood the sands of time for a game very well, But anyway, remember, if you like the videos, like, subscribe, comment, share, support the channel if you want. I appreciate it. Thanks. The end.